You're not joking?
No.
With that?
No.
You're not joking? With that? The kid behind the bench was still laughing when the old man set the pellet gun on the felt, a battered Crosman, bluing, worn to grey at the muzzle, a strip of black electrical tape holding the cracked rear sight in place. The crowd laughed with him because the kid was a Marine Scout sniper instructor, with a sponsor's patch sewn over his heart, and the old man was 79. Stoop-shouldered, feed-store cap, and a pair of brown shoes he had resoled himself. A 4-inch steel plate swung on a slow arm, 100 yards downrange. Nobody had beaten the course record on it in 11 years. The old man asked if he could try. By the time he was done, 300 people had stopped laughing. One of them was crying. Type honour in the comments if you believe some men should never be underestimated. Earl Dunmore had been awake since 4 that morning, which was not unusual, because the war had rearranged his sleep a half a century ago and never put it back the way it found it. He had made his coffee in the dark, the way he always did, and he had stood at the kitchen window of the small house outside Knoxville and watched the sky go from black to the colour of gunmetal to the pale, washed-out blue of an October dawn. He had buried his wife in that same colour of light 4 years ago, and he still set out 2 cups, out of a habit his hands refused to break, and he still poured the second one down the sink without a word. He was a tall man once. You could still see it in the architecture of him, in the long bones of his forearms and the breadth of shoulders that age had folded forward like a closing book. He moved slowly now, not clumsily. There was an economy to the way he crossed a room, a stillness that lived underneath the slowness, the way a heron stands in shallow water. People who met him thought he was shy. He wasn't. He was simply a man who had learned, a long time ago, and at a terrible price, that the world told you most of what you needed to know, if you would only hold still long enough to let it. The stillness had not come naturally to a boy, raised loud and barefoot in a Tennessee hollow. It had been ground into him over months on cold ranges, and then welded permanently into place over 2 years, in a country where motion attracted the kind of attention a man did not survive. He had brought it home with him the way other men brought home a limp or a cough or a name they could no longer say without their voice changing, and it had outlasted his marriage and his uniform, and very nearly his grief, this terrible, patient, beautiful capacity to become motionless and let everything else in the world reveal itself to him in its own time. His hands had a tremor in them. Most folks assumed it was age, and Earl let them assume it, because the truth was a longer conversation than he cared to have with strangers. In the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, against his chest, he carried a single dog tag, worn smooth as a river stone, the stamped letters rubbed almost flat, by 57 years of his thumb passing over them. He touched it now, the way another man might check for his wallet, and then he picked up his keys and the long canvas case from the closet and went out to the truck. Teat. He did not know, driving down the interstate with the heater ticking and the radio off, that he was driving toward the morning that would undo 11 years of a record no living man had touched. He only knew there was a gun show at the fairgrounds, and that he had not held a rifle among other men who understood them in a very long time. Regional Precision Rifle Expo took up 3 steel barns at the county fairgrounds. By 10 o'clock on its second morning, the place smelled the way those places always smell. Gun oil and burnt powder drifting in from the outdoor, range, kettle corn, cold concrete, the coppery tang of brass tumbling in a polisher at somebody's reloading booth. Banners hung from the rafters. Men in tactical ball caps walked the aisles with paper coffee cups, picking up rifles and shouldering them and putting them down, talking in the low, fluent shorthand of people who share a passion most of the rest of the world finds strange. The centrepiece of the whole show was out back, past the last barn, where the gravel gave way to a 100-yard range mowed into the field. A company called Meridian Defence had built the featured attraction, a swinging steel plate, 4 inches across, hung on a slow mechanical arm that pushed it out and let it drift back on a lazy, hypnotic arc, like the pendulum of a grandfather clock that had decided to take its time. The challenge was simple to explain and nearly impossible to do. 10 hits, called and consecutive, on a moving target the size of a coffee saucer, timed from the first shot to the last. Clock on the scoreboard had read the same numbers for 11 years. 2 minutes, 14 seconds, set by a man who had since gone on to shoot for the national team, and never once approached, since, though hundreds had tried. The man running the booth was named Cole Renner, and he was very good, and he knew it. He was 31, lean and squared away, 4 years out of the Marine Corps, where he had been a scout sniper instructor, host, and he had the easy contempt of a young man who has been the best in every room he has ever walked into. He ran the demonstration every hour on the hour, dropping the plate with crisp, fast, beautiful shots, while the crowd murmured, and afterward he sold rifles and scopes, and signed the occasional autograph for a teenager. What the crowd that gathered around his booth that morning did not know was that Cole Renner's sponsorship with Meridian was up for renewal in 3 weeks, that the numbers had been soft, and that the man smiling behind the bench was carrying a great deal more weight on his shoulders than any of them could see. Earl came up the gravel slope with his canvas case under his arm a little before 11. He stood at the back of the crowd. For a while, the way he stood everywhere watching. He watched Cole shoot the plate down in 1:51, well off the record, but fast and clean, and he watched the crowd clap, and he watched the young man soak it up. And then, when the demonstration was over and the spectators began to drift, Earl Dunmore walked up to the bench, set down his case, unzipped it, and lifted out the pellet gun. Cole looked at it. He looked at the man holding it. Then he laughed, not cruelly, not yet, but the laugh of someone genuinely amused, and he said the words that 200 people would remember for the rest of their lives. "You're not joking with that?" He picked the Crosman up off the felt without asking, turned it over in his hands, held it out to the crowd like a comedian showing the audience his prop. "Folks, this gentleman wants to shoot the course." Ripple of laughter ran through the people gathered there. Cole was grinning now, riding it. What is this? A 40-year-old air rifle. Sir, this thing shoots a lead pellet. The plate's 100 yards out. You understand that, right? You understand it's 100 yards? Earl said. I understand. That was all. He held out his hand for the gun, and Cole, after a beat, gave it back, still smiling, glancing at his assistant by the scope cart, with an expression that said, "Watch this is going to be good." The assistant, 19-year-old named Jesse, who had idolized Cole since high school, grinned and pulled out his phone and started recording, because this was going to be a clip worth keeping. Earl took the pellet gun back and held it the way you would hold something that had been to a lot places with you. He did not argue. He did not explain. He looked downrange at the plate, drifting out and easing back on its slow arm, out and back, and something in his face changed. Not much, just a settling, a kind of attention coming into his eyes that none of them had the experience to recognize. What none of them knew, they laughed and filmed and waited for the old man to embarrass himself, was that they were not watching a joke, they were watching a man come home. The crowd thickened. That was the way of these things. Laughter draws a crowd faster than gunfire. Word moved down the aisles of the barns. There was an old-timer out back about to try the record plate with a BB gun. People came out into the grey morning to see it. 40 became 80, became 150, standing in a loose horseshoe behind the firing line, phones up, grinning, waiting. Cole was enjoying himself now. He had a microphone clipped to his collar that fed the little PA speaker on the cart, and he used it. "All right, let's give the man some room," he said, the way a carnival barker gives a mark some room. "Sir, you want me to explain the course of fire? I watched you shoot it," Earl said. "Right, okay." Cole spread his hands at the crowd, playing it. "He watched me shoot it, so you know it's 10 hits, consecutive, plates moving. We run the clock from your first shot. Record's 214. Held for 11 years. He smiled. No pressure. A few people laughed. An older woman near the front did not. She was watching Earl's hands, the way they had gone completely still around the rifle. And something about that stillness had quieted her. Cole worked the crowd while the old man got himself situated. Because that was the instinct that paid his bills. Keep them entertained, keep them buying. Never let the energy sag. He talked about the plate, about the 11 years, about the man who had set the record and gone on to the national team. He told a joke about the last fellow who had tried it with a borrowed rifle and missed all 10. He was, underneath the easy patter, more rattled than he let on. The truth was that the renewal meeting with Meridian was 3 weeks out. The foot traffic at the booth had been thin all weekend. Viral clip of an old-timer making a fool of himself was exactly the kind of thing that moved units. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as a man putting on a show, which is a thing a man can tell himself, right up until the moment the show turns on him. Del Hooper saw it too. Del was 66, the range master, a retired gunnery sergeant who had run the safety operations at the fairgrounds for 2 decades, and had seen every kind of fool come through his line. He had been about to walk over and gently put a stop to this. There were liability, forms. There was the question of whether a pellet would even reach the plate with enough authority to register a hit. There was the basic dignity of not letting a crowd make sport of an old man. He had taken 3 steps toward the bench when he stopped. He stopped because he had watched Earl pick up that battered air rifle and, without seeming to think about it, run his thumb across the action and check the seating with a motion so smooth, so automatic, so deeply grooved into muscle and bone. Del Hooper felt the hair stand up on his forearms. He had seen that motion before. He had seen it on men who had done a thing 10,000 times in places where doing it wrong got people killed. Del took a slow breath and stepped back. And he did not say a word, because some part of him understood that he was about to witness something, and he did not want to be the man who interrupted it. Earl set the pellet gun down on the bench, and instead of leaning into it standing, he lowered himself to the mat. He sat. He crossed his ankles and drew them in, and let his elbows find the inside of his knees, settling his whole frame down into a shape that looked, to the laughing crowd, like an old man simply getting comfortable. It was not that, it was a sitting position, a specific one. The kind they no longer taught quite this way, and a few of the older Shuhas in the crowd stopped smiling when they saw it, because they recognized the bones of it, even if they could not have named where it came from. What none of them knew, watching this 79-year-old fold himself onto a shooting mat at a county gun show, was that the last time he had taken that exact position for something that mattered, the man kneeling beside him had not lived to see the sun go down. He had learned it at Camp Lejeune in the late winter of 1968, on a wet field with the Atlantic wind coming in cold off the sound. from a staff sergeant named Pruett, who chewed sunflower seeds and never raised his voice, and could put 5 rounds into a playing card at 300 yards in a crosswind. Earl had been 19, a skinny kid out of a hollow in East Tennessee, who had grown up shooting squirrels out of poplar trees with a single-shot .22 to put meat on the table, and the Marine Corps had taken one look at his scores and known what it had. Pruett kept him on that field long after the others had gone in to dry off and warm up, hour after hour in the freezing drizzle, breaking down every part of how Earl held himself and rebuilding it from the ground. He taught him to sit. Really sit, fold his body into a tripod of bone, and let the rifle rest on the platform of himself rather than fighting it. He taught him to stop gripping and start settling. "You're not holding the rifle," Pruett used to say, spitting a seed into the grass. "You're holding still, and the rifle is just along for the ride." He had taught him the breath, the long controlled exhale, the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of it, where the body went quiet and the heartbeat slowed, and there opened up, between one beat and the next, a window no wider than a single second, through which a patient man could thread a thing that an impatient man would never even see. Earl had carried that window through 2 tours. He had carried it up onto a ridgeline that the maps gave a number, and the men gave another name, and he had held a position there for the better part of 2 days, with a spotter at his side, a quiet, funny, fearless kid from El Paso named Daniel Reyes, who called him Old Man, though Earl was only 22, because Earl never rushed, never panicked, never wasted emotion. They had lain up there together through the heat of the days and the bone-cold of the nights, sharing a single canteen and a tin of crackers and 1,000 whispered words about everything and nothing. Danny's girl back home, the truck he was going to buy, the names he had already picked out for children, who did not yet exist, Danny used to say. Earl could read the swing of a thing, the sway of grass, the drift of smoke, the lazy back-and-forth pendulum of a banana leaf in the wind, and tell you to the half-second when it would come back to where you wanted it. "He don't shoot the target," Danny told the others, laughing. "He shoots the clock. Man's a clockmaker." The name stuck. Up and down that line they called him the clockmaker, and the name followed him into a citation that Earl never read aloud and kept folded in a shoebox in a closet, because the day he earned it was the same day the swing of things took Daniel Reyes away from him. There was not a medal forged in any foundry on earth that was worth that trade. He carried the dog tag still, 57 years, against his heart, his thumb wearing the letters smooth. He touched it, now there on the mat, in front of 300 laughing strangers, and then he laid his cheek against the worn stock of a $40 pellet gun, and he found his window. The plate swung out, the plate drifted back, breathed out, long and slow, and somewhere in the bottom of that breath the whole loud morning went quiet, and he watched the steel come back along its arc, the way Pruett taught him, and Danny had named him for, and at the precise instant the plate hung weightless at the top of its swing. That half-second of stillness before it fell back the other way. He pressed the trigger. The pellet gun made a flat, unimpressive sound, a pop, almost polite, swallowed up by the open field. Full second nothing happened. And Cole Renner's mouth was already curling towards something to say, and Jesse was already half lowering his phone. Then, from 100 yards out, faint and clear and unmistakable across the cold morning air, came a single high silver note. Ting! The plate jumped on its arm. Dead center. Nobody laughed. The PA speaker hummed with empty static. Cole Renner stood with his microphone halfway to his mouth, and the smile dying on his face by degrees. And out in the crowd somebody said, very quietly, "No way." and somebody else just breathed out a word that was not quite a word. 300 miles of confidence drained out of the booth like water out of a cracked glass, because 100 yards away, a 4-inch plate was still ringing, still trembling on its arm, and an older man in a feed store cap was already working the action of a battered pellet gun, his eyes never leaving the swing, settling back down into his breath, as if the first shot had only been him saying hello. What not one person in that crowd had noticed, in all the laughing, was that 2 rows back a man in civilian clothes, with a high and tight haircut going grey at the temples, had gone absolutely rigid, the coffee forgotten in his hand, staring at the seated figure on the mat, as though he'd seen a ghost rise up out of 57 years of his own life. His name was Marcus Reyes, and he was the senior enlisted Marine in the Corps' marksmanship training program, a sergeant major with 29 years invited to the expo to speak that afternoon on a panel about the future of precision shooting. He had wandered out to watch the famous record plate out of professional curiosity, expecting nothing, and he had laughed along with everyone else when the old man pulled out the air rifle, because what else was there to do? But he had stopped laughing the moment Earl Dunmore lowered himself onto that mat. Marcus had spent his entire adult life around shooters. He knew positions the way a musician knows chords, and he had never in 29 years seen a living man take that particular sitting position, that exact fold of the body, that ankle cross and elbow set, anywhere but in one place. A yellowed, black and white training photograph that hung in a glass case at the schoolhouse, captioned with a name that every student who passed through those doors was made to learn, and there was the breath, the long exhale, the weight. Marcus Reyes felt his heart begin to pound in a way it had not pounded since combat, because he was watching a man do a thing that he had been taught, that his instructors had been taught, that was in the manual, under a heading none of the young Marines ever questioned, and the man was doing it with a child's air rifle, and he was not missing. Marcus's father had carried a name out of a war and given it to his son like an inheritance, the name of the man who had been beside him on a ridgeline in 1969. The man who had held a position alone for 9 more hours after Daniel Reyes was gone, so that the rest of them could get down off that hill alive. He had grown up on that name. He had been raised on that name the way other boys were raised on scripture. And he had spent 30 years believing the man who owned it was dead. Earl fired again. Ting, the plate jumped. He worked the action. Pop, and the steel rang a 3rd time before the 2nd ring had finished fading. And now the crowd was making a sound, a low rising vowel of disbelief that climbed with every hit. Pop, ting, pop, ting. He was not hurrying. That was the thing that broke people's minds about it afterward. The thing they could not stop describing in the comments under Jesse's video. He was not fast in the way Cole was fast, all snap and aggression. He was fast the way a clock is fast, which is to say he was not fast at all. He was simply never early and never late. Each shot left the muzzle at the precise instant the plate reached the top of its arc and hung still, so that the pellet and the pause arrived in the same place at the same moment, again and again and again, though the old man were not shooting the plate at all but conducting it. 4, 5, 6. Cole Renner stood frozen at his own bench, staring at the scoreboard clock, and the number on it was climbing far too slowly. They were already past the halfway mark, in time most men needed for 2 shots. 7, 8. The crowd had gone from disbelief to something close to reverence. 300 people utterly silent, except for the building wave of breath, and out at the edge of it, Del Hooper had taken off his hat and was holding it against his chest, without seeming to know he had done it. 9. Plate rang and danced, one left. Earl Dunmore exhaled one final time, let the world go quiet, watched the swing come home and squeezed. Ting. The scoreboard clock stopped at 1 minute 51 seconds. For a moment the number meant nothing to anyone, and then Jesse, the 19-year-old, looked up from his phone with his face gone white and said, into the silence, loud enough for everyone to hear, That broke it, the record. He broke it by 23 seconds. And the horseshoe of people came apart into noise, a roar of it, hands in the air, but Earl did not seem to hear them. He was already lowering the pellet gun, already unfolding his old body up off the mat, one joint at a time, when a voice cut through the cheering from 2 rows back. A voice that did not shout, but carried the way a parade deck voice carries, trained to be heard over 1,000 men, and it said one word that turned the crowd to stone. Clockmaker. The roar died as if a hand had closed over it. Heads turned, Cole Renner turned. Earl Dunmore, halfway to his feet, went very still. A man was coming through the crowd, and the crowd was parting for him without being asked. The way crowds do for a certain kind of man, and his eyes were fixed on Earl, and they were wet and shining, and his jaw was working like a man trying to hold something back that would not be held. He stopped 6 feet from the old veteran. He came to attention, not stiffly, not for show, but the way a body does a thing it was built to do. And his voice cracked clean down the middle when he spoke. "You're Earl Dunmore," he said. "You're the clockmaker. My God, they told us you were dead." Earl looked at him for a long moment, at the grey, at the temples, and the something in the shape of the eyes. And his weathered face moved through confusion toward a recognition that hollowed it out. "Who are you, son?" he said quietly. Marcus, the big man's chin trembled. "Marcus Reyes. Daniel Reyes was my father." He stopped, swallowed, made himself go on. "You were on that hill with him. You're the reason I had a father long enough to remember his face. He told me about you every birthday of my life. He told me." His voice gave out entirely. And he stood there in front of 300 strangers and a record-breaking pellet gun, Sergeant Major of the United States Marine Corps, with 29 years and 3 wars on his shoulders. And he wept openly, helplessly, the way a man weeps, only for the dead and the suddenly. Not dead. He told me you carried something off that hill. He said you'd never let it go. And Earl Dunmore reached up with a trembling hand to the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. The crowd did not understand yet, but they understood that they were standing inside something, and they kept silent for it. Cole Renner had come out from behind his bench. He had set his microphone down somewhere, and forgotten it. The contempt was gone off his young face, and in its place was the dawning, sickening look of a man realizing exactly what he had done, and to whom Marcus Reyes, fighting himself back under control, turned and addressed the crowd because that was who he was. A man who taught, could not let a thing of importance pass without making others understand it. "Some of you don't know what you just watched," he said, his voice steadying with the effort of carrying it. "So I'm going to tell you. This man's name is in the manual we teach from at the Scout Sniper School. There's a position in there, the way he just sat down on that mat, and there's a method of timing a moving target that some of you saw him use just now, reading the swing, breaking the shot at the top of the arc. He had to stop and breathe. We teach it as the Dunmore method. We have for 50 years. Half the instructors who teach it have no idea there was ever a real Dunmore. They think it's just a name." He looked back at Earl and his voice dropped, gone soft and raw. "And every single one of you stood here and laughed at him. Nobody moved. Jesse, the boy with the phone, had lowered it, and was crying without making any sound. Del Hooper had his hat over his heart, and his head bowed. In the spring of 1969, Marcus went on, because they needed to hear it. and because he had waited his whole life to say it to someone who would understand. A position got cut off on a ridge above a valley I won't bore you with the name of. 2 men, a sniper and his spotter. They were supposed to hold it for a few hours so a column could move through the low ground without getting cut to pieces. His jaw flexed. They held it for a day and a half. The spotter, my father, was hit on the 2nd morning. And the sniper stayed. He could have come down. The mission was already a success. He stayed on that ridge alone, with his spotter gone beside him, for 9 more hours, because there were still men in the valley who hadn't cleared it. And as long as he held that high ground they lived. Marcus Reyes looked at Earl Dunmore, and the tears ran free down the lined planes of his face. 41 men walked out of that valley alive. My father didn't. But before he died, he gave this man his tag, and he asked him to carry it home. He turned back to the crowd. He's been carrying it for 57 years. What none of them knew, what made the women in the front row press their hands to their mouths when it came, was that Earl Dunmore had never once in 57 years told a living soul the rest of it. Daniel Reyes had a son on the way that he would never meet, and that the last thing the dying man had asked with his hand closed around Earl's, not to be remembered as a hero, but only to be remembered at all. Earl drew the dog tag out of his pocket then. He held it in the open palm of his trembling hand, the metal worn to a soft gleam, the stamped letters his thumb had loved smooth over more than half a century. And he looked at it the way a man looks at the last photograph of someone he can no longer fully picture. The crowd had gone so quiet you could hear the plate out on the range, still faintly creaking on its arm. "He talked about you," Earl said. His voice was rough, little used. "Whole time. Drove me half crazy. Showed me a picture of your mama till the edges wore off. Ghost of something crossed his face. Grief and tenderness braided together. He said if it was a boy he was going to call him Marcus, after his own daddy." He looked up at the weeping sergeant major. "I went to find you after. Tried for years. Address didn't pan out. Name was common. And his jaw worked. "I'll be honest with you, son. There was a stretch where I couldn't go looking. There was a stretch where I couldn't hardly get out of a chair. I put the tag in my pocket, and I told myself I'd carry it, till I found the boy or till they buried me, whichever came first. And I'd long since made my peace it'd be the second one." He reached out, and he laid the dog tag in Marcus Reyes's enormous, scarred, shaking hand, and he closed the younger man's fingers around it with both of his own. "Took you 57 years to find me," Earl said softly. "But you weren't never lost. He never lost you. Not for a second. You were the last thing on his mind, and you were the best thing in it." Marcus Reyes folded over the tag and his shoulders shook. And there was not a dry eye in 300 people, and out of all of them it was Cole Renner, who could not stop looking at the ground. One, a host. The thing about the moment after, the thing the video could never quite capture for the millions who would eventually watch it, how gentle it became. Marcus Reyes stood and wept, and then he laughed through it, wiping his face with the back of his wrist, and he gripped Earl Dunmore by both shoulders and held him at arm's length and looked at him the way you look at a thing you cannot believe is real, solid in front of you. And then the sergeant major did something that made the older shooters in the crowd suck in their breath. He stepped back, and he came to attention, and he saluted. A salute is for officers, and for the flag, and for the fallen, and a man of Marcus's rank and experience does not throw one casually. But there are exceptions written nowhere in any regulation, exceptions a man makes, with his own body for his own reasons, and Marcus Reyes held that salute, eyes streaming, for a long 3 seconds before he brought it down. It was the salute of a son to the man who had given him a father to remember, the salute of an instructor to the source of the words he had spoken in a classroom 1,000 times. Without knowing they belonged to a living man, the salute of one Marine across 57 years to another, who had held a piece of high ground so that 41 men, and, through one of them, boy not yet born, could go on living. The whole crowd felt the weight of it, even if they could not have named every thread, and a hush settled over that gravel slope that no carnival barker's microphone could ever have bought. Earl returned it. Old as he was, his hand still knew the way. Cole Renner came forward. He had been standing at the edge of it, and now he crossed the gravel with the careful, miserable steps of a man approaching something he has broken. He stopped in front of Earl, and he could not find the smooth, easy words that had come to him so freely an hour before. "Sir," he said, and his voice was not steady. "Sir, I don't have any way to. I made a joke of you. In front of all these people, picked up your weapon, and I held it over my head like a—" He stopped. He started again. "I teach the Dunmore method, taught it to 200 Marines. I stand up in front of a classroom, and I say the name, and I never once. I thought it was just a name in a book." He swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry. There's no version of sorry big enough, but I'm sorry." Crowd waited to see what the old man would do, and what he did was not what comeuppance stories train people to expect. Earl looked at Cole Renner for a long moment, at the young, strong, mortified face, and what came into his own eyes was not triumph, was something closer to recognition. "How old are you, son?" "31, sir." Earl nodded slowly. "I was 19 the first time I made a fool of myself in front of men who knew better. Pruitt, fella who taught me. Let me sit there and stew in it a good long while, and then you know what he told me?" Earl's mouth bent. "Oops," he said. "The only shooter who never gets humbled is one who never gets good enough to find out how much he doesn't know." He reached out and put his old hand on the young man's shoulder. "You're good, son. I watched you shoot. You're real good. The fast is all there. Now you just got to live long enough to learn the slow." He tilted his head toward the range, toward the plate, still hanging on its arm. "It's not about the speed. It never was. It's about being still inside while everything else moves. You can't teach a man that out of a book. I'm not sure anybody can teach it at all. But I'd be glad to show you what I know. If you ever want to come sit on a mat with an old man, Cole Renner," the sponsored prodigy who had walked into that morning the best shooter in every room, stood in front of 300 witnesses and cried like the kid he still was, and nodded and said, "Yes, sir, I would. I'd like that more than anything." The story did not stay at the fairgrounds. Jesse's video, the laughter, the first impossible ting, the salute, dog tag passing from one shaking hand to another, went out into the world that night, and was watched 11 million times before the week was done, and then 100 million, and people who had never fired a gun in their lives sat at their kitchen tables and wept over an old man in a feed, store cap. But the things that mattered most were smaller than the numbers, and never trended anywhere. Meridian Defence retired the course record and recast the plate. And they hung a small brass placard beside it that read the Dunmore plate. Underneath, in smaller letters, the only thing Earl would agree to let them write. For the men who held the high ground, he would not let them put his own name on it. He said the high ground was one never held by one man, and he wasn't about to start lying about it at 79. Cole Renner drove to Knoxville the following month, and the month after that, and the month after that. He sat on a mat in Earl Dunmore's back field with a thermos of coffee between them and learned, slowly, painfully, beautifully, how to be still inside while everything moved. The first few visits Earl barely corrected him at all. He just made the young man sit and breathe and watch a length of surveyor's tape twist in the wind off the ridge behind the house, until Cole began, without being told, to feel the rhythm of it in his own chest. He got quieter. The men he taught the following year noticed it and could not have told you why, only that their instructor had stopped trying to impress them and started trying to reach them, which is a different and much rarer thing. 2 years on, when Meridian renewed his contract, Cole had a clause written into it that he never publicised. Portion went each year to a scholarship at the marksmanship school in the name of a spotter from El Paso who never came home. Del Hooper, the old range master, told the story at his VFW post until the day he died, and he always told it the same way, and he always took his hat off at the same part. He said he had run that line for 20 years and waved off 100 fools, and the one time he kept his mouth shut and let an old man have his moment was the proudest thing he ever did standing still. And there was a girl, no older than 16, who had been at the show that day with her father. Slight thing. The high school coaches kept telling was too small to shoot for the team. She had watched Earl Dunmore fold himself onto that mat and unmake 11 years of certainty. With a $40 pellet gun, something in her had gone quiet and certain. She wrote Earl a letter. He wrote her back in a careful, old-fashioned hand. What he told her was the same thing a staff sergeant had told him on a wet field at Camp Lejeune in 1968. You're not holding the rifle. You're holding still. The rifle is just along for the ride. Marcus Reyes flew his father's dog tag to El Paso and laid it for a long afternoon on the grave of the woman who had waited her whole life to know how her husband died, who had raised their son alone on a single fading photograph and a single repeated story, host, and who had gone to her own grave still wondering whether the man beside Daniel on that hill had been worthy of the trust her husband placed in him with his last breath. Marcus knelt there in the dry Texas wind and told her, out loud, that the man had been worthy, that he had carried it 57 years, that he had never stopped looking, that the boy she raised had finally been found. And then the sergeant major picked the tag back up off the warm granite and kept it against his own heart, in the breast pocket over the place where his father had asked for it, to go 57 years, and one cold October morning, 4. Earl Dunmore still wakes at 4. He still makes the coffee in the dark. But there's a photograph on his refrigerator now of a sergeant major and a young instructor and an old Marine, 3 of them squinting into the same low gold light. And on Sunday afternoons there is sometimes a girl on a mat in his back field, learning to find the window between one heartbeat and the next. He doesn't talk much. He never did. He just holds still, the way he was taught, class, and he lets the world tell him what it has to say. They laughed at him because he was old, and because his rifle was worn, because they thought a man's worth could be read off the surface of him, like a price tag. They were wrong, and they learned it in the space of a single high silver note, ringing across a cold field. Some men carry more than you could ever guess by looking. Some men have held a piece of high ground you'll never see, paid a price you'll never know, and asked for nothing in return, but be allowed to carry it home. The measure of a man was never the crispness of his uniform, or the newness of his rifle, or the steadiness of his hands. It was what he would endure in silence. For how long? For people who would never know his name. This story moved you. If you believe the quiet ones among us deserve to be seen before it's too late to thank them, do one thing for an old Marine and the men he never stopped carrying. Subscribe and stay a while. There are more of them out there than you think, sitting in plastic chairs and waiting rooms and feed store caps, holding still, waiting for someone patient enough to look. Don't be the one who laughs. Be the one who sees.